The ships first appeared hovering silently above the capitals of the world. They cast long shadows over cities that had, for centuries, stood as symbols of human achievement. They arrived without warning. No diplomatic overtures, no declarations of intent, just massive, silent vessels that blotted out the sun. The President of the United States stood in the office, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair as he watched the live footage. Beijing was already gone. The message had come an hour before, a single, haunting transmission from the Chinese government, before all communications were severed. They are not here to negotiate. Across the globe, panic reigned. Leaders scrambled. Militaries mobilized, but nothing they did made any difference. The aliens, tall and faceless beings wrapped in metallic armor, moved through the world's defenses like phantoms. Their ships remained motionless in the sky while drones descended in a silent swarm, overpowering cities and military bases with surgical precision. In the days that followed, humanity learned the true horror of their new overlords. These invaders did not merely seek conquest. They sought complete and absolute dominion. Each fallen city was stripped of autonomy. Men, women, and children were implanted with neural devices that controlled their every move. Nations that had once thrived with their own cultures and governments became little more than labor camps, where the human mind was bent to the alien will. Commander Abigail Mitchell had watched as her home in London fell. Now in a bunker beneath the Appalachian Mountains, she coordinated what was left of the global resistance. Her face, usually hard and unreadable, now showed the strain of endless days without sleep, planning escapes and sabotage missions that ended in failure more often than not. "The latest reports from Europe are grim," she said. The room was full of military strategists and resistance leaders, but no one spoke. They all knew the truth. The world was crumbling. Paris, Berlin, and Madrid have fallen. Their populations enslaved. She took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the table. The aliens aren't just killing, they're breaking us. General Lawson, a grizzled veteran from the American Midwest, slammed his fist on the table. "We can't just sit here and wait for our turn. What's the status of our forces on the East Coast?" Mitchell shook her head. "We've lost contact. It's only a matter of time before they target us directly." The atmosphere in the room thickened with despair, but in the darkness, there was still a spark of hope. America, isolated and vast, had yet to fall. There was something about the country's sheer size, its decentralized population, and its scattered military infrastructure that made it more difficult for the aliens to subjugate. But Mitchell knew that this edge wouldn't last forever. "They're coming here next," she said, her voice tight. "But we have something they don't expect. For all their technology, for all their mind-bending power, the aliens had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the human spirit. They had crushed nations quickly, but in doing so, they had forced survivors to come together in ways previously unimaginable. Underground movements formed not just to resist, but to survive. Hushed whispers of America's unconventional tactics, their ability to fight dirty, had started to spread through the networks. The aliens may have conquered with brute strength, but humans were about to strike back with ingenuity. Back in the control center, the monitors blinked with data from across the globe. Enslaved populations were working in unison to construct vast, unknowable structures at the command of their captors. Yet, deep in the recesses of each mind, something was stirring. A resistance, invisible but growing, sparked within those who had not yet been fully broken. Across the oceans, whispers traveled through the enslaved networks that America still stood, and with it, a flicker of hope for the world. In one of the few remaining cities that hadn't fallen, an American mechanic, Joe Carter, stood on the roof of a building, staring at the ships in the distance. His hands, calloused from years of manual labor, clenched into fists. He wasn't a soldier, but he didn't need to be. Joe knew deep down that the fight ahead wouldn't be won in conventional ways. America's survival, and perhaps the world's, would depend on ordinary people rising when everything seemed lost. "We're still here," Joe said to himself, determination tightening his jaw. The invaders had taken everything from him, his home, his family, but they hadn't taken his resolve. He would fight, not just for himself, but for all those who had already fallen. The world had fallen, but America still stood, and in the ashes of global defeat, a fire began to burn. The invasion began quietly at first, an eerie calm blanketing the skies over the American heartland. For days, the ships lingered at the borders, as if the aliens themselves were assessing their next move. To the rest of the world, it seemed America's fall was inevitable. Another nation to be crushed under the weight of the invaders' relentless power. But something about the vast expanse of the country seemed to give the aliens pause. And then, without warning, they struck. In an instant, the skies above New York City filled with the familiar sight of drones. People scattered through the streets, seeking shelter as buildings crumbled under fire. This was no surgical strike. It was devastation on a scale unlike anything the country had ever seen. The aliens had decided to make an example out of America's most iconic city, a show of strength meant to demoralize the last holdout of human resistance. But they underestimated America. In the depths of a war room beneath the Pentagon, Commander Abigail Mitchell stood at the center of a buzzing hive of activity. The attack on New York had been expected, perhaps even welcomed as a strategic opportunity. America had used the weeks leading up to the invasion to study the aliens' tactics, identifying weaknesses in their seemingly impenetrable armor. Mitchell's eyes flicked across the data streaming in from the East Coast. "They've dropped most of their forces in Manhattan," she said, her voice calm yet hard. "Exactly what we predicted." General Lawson leaned over the table, his weathered face set in a grim expression. "And the countermeasures?" "In place," Mitchell responded. "We've got traps along every major exit route. The drones won't know what hit them." For all their technological superiority, the aliens had grown predictable. Their invasions followed a pattern: strike fast, overwhelm, and enslave. But America had spent years perfecting unconventional warfare. Where other nations relied on brute military force, the Americans had learned to fight in shadows, using guerrilla tactics and cyber warfare to exploit their enemies' arrogance. On the ground, the initial chaos of the invasion began to shift. Small bands of American soldiers, armed with alien technology reverse-engineered from early skirmishes, launched a counterattack. In the tunnels beneath New York, groups of civilian hackers worked frantically, overriding the drones' control signals and turning them against their creators. Buildings rigged with explosives crumbled as alien forces moved through the streets, cutting off their escape routes. In the heart of Manhattan, Joe Carter, the mechanic who had survived the early attacks, was now part of the underground militia. Clad in makeshift armor, Joe moved through the wreckage with a small squad, taking down drones and alien-foot soldiers with weapons cobbled together from the remnants of their own technology. He had never imagined himself a fighter, but this wasn't about being a soldier anymore. This was survival. Joe's squad reached the base of an alien command tower, a tall, gleaming structure that had been erected in the first wave of the attack. "We take this down, we send a message," Joe said, gripping his weapon tightly. "Think we'll live to see that message delivered?" One of his squad mates muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. Joe smirked, his eyes narrowing as he gazed up at the towering structure. "Doesn't matter, long as they know we're not done yet." Back at the Pentagon, Mitchell monitored the battle closely. The aliens had underestimated the resilience of the American spirit. What they saw as chaos, the sprawling, decentralized nature of the country's defenses, was, in fact, its strength. In every corner of the nation, small cells of resistance were rising up, hitting the invaders from angles they hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, a flashing red light on the console caught Mitchell's attention. A series of intercepted alien communications scrolled across the screen. "They're rerouting," she said, her pulse quickening. "They're pulling back their forces from the West Coast." Lawson looked up. "What does that mean?" "They're nervous," Mitchell replied, her eyes narrowing. "We've rattled them." This was the first real sign of alien uncertainty. While the rest of the world had been crushed, America had refused to submit. And now, They had the invaders on the defensive. Mitchell pressed a button on her console, sending a coded signal to resistance leaders across the country. It's time. We hit them where it hurts. As the message spread, small pockets of resistance in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Dallas activated their plans. The aliens had stretched their forces too thin, focusing all their energy on the East Coast. Now, America was about to strike back on multiple fronts. Joe Carter's squad reached the core of the alien command tower, setting the charges they had carried through the ruins of the city. As they retreated to a safe distance, Joe looked back at the towering structure. It wasn't just metal and machinery. It was a symbol of the invaders' arrogance. And in a few moments, it would be gone. The explosion rocked the streets of Manhattan, sending debris flying into the sky. As the tower collapsed, cheers erupted from the surviving resistance fighters. They had won this battle. But the war was far from over. In the war room, Mitchell allowed herself a small smile. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. "They're not invincible, and now they know it." The aliens had come to America expecting a swift victory. Instead, they had found a nation that refused to die. The air above Washington crackled with the energy of a world on the brink. The once pristine monuments to freedom now stood scarred and battered, but they had endured, just like the people. The final phase of the war had begun. In the heart of the Pentagon's underground bunker, Commander Abigail Mitchell studied the holographic display in front of her, tracing the paths of alien troop movements. The invaders had consolidated their forces, regrouping around their central command ship, which now hovered ominously over the White House. The alien leader, a creature whose intelligence was as cold as its visage, believed this would be the final, decisive strike. But America had other plans. "Their command structure is vulnerable," Mitchell said, turning to General Lawson, who stood by her side. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. "We've identified the neural control hub. It's the key to their entire operation. If we take it out, we sever their connection to the enslaved human population." Lawson nodded grimly. "And if we fail?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Then it's over. For all of us." Outside, the resistance had mobilized in full force. Across the country, groups of militia, hackers, and civilians had launched coordinated strikes against the alien drones, using the very technology they had stolen from their oppressors. The aliens, once methodical and ruthless, were now disoriented, their tactical advantage slowly eroding. America's decentralized strategy had confused them, and now their last bastion of control was all that remained. Joe Carter, the mechanic-turned-soldier, crouched behind the wreckage of a military vehicle, his heart pounding in his chest. His squad was positioned near the perimeter of the alien command ship, awaiting Mitchell's signal. They were the spearhead of the final assault, a ragtag group of survivors, armed with alien rifles and human ingenuity. Beside him, Lena, a former hacker from San Francisco, glanced up at the towering ship. "Hard to believe this, is it, huh?" Joe nodded, his eyes locked on the target. "Yeah, hard to believe we've made it this far." The mission was simple: infiltrate the ship, destroy the neural hub, and cripple the alien forces. But the simplicity of the plan belied the stakes. Joe knew that if they failed, humanity's last chance at survival would vanish. Mitchell's voice crackled over the comms. "Team Alpha, you're a go. Take them down." Joe's squad moved swiftly, using the wreckage and debris as cover. Alien drones hovered overhead, scanning the area, but their once impenetrable defenses had weakened. The resistance had spent weeks hacking into their systems, disrupting their communications and blinding their sensors. As they approached the ship, Lena hacked into the access panel, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "We're in," she whispered. The squad slipped inside the massive structure, navigating its labyrinthine corridors. The interior was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Joe felt a chill run down his spine as they passed rows of glass chambers, each containing a human soldier, motionless, their minds controlled by the aliens' neural implants. They enslaved us, Joe muttered, his voice thick with anger. But today, we take it all back. At the heart of the ship, they found the neural control hub, a pulsating, organic structure surrounded by alien technology. It was grotesque, a fusion of biology and machinery, with tendrils snaking out from its core, connecting to the ship's main systems. This was the brain of the operation, the source of the aliens' control over their human captives. Lena set to work, rigging explosives around the hub while Joe and the others kept watch. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, Lena stood, her face pale but resolute. It's done. Joe pressed his hand to the detonator, his mind racing. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of humanity. He thought of all the people who had fallen, of the cities that had been reduced to rubble, and of the millions enslaved by the invaders. This was for them. With a steady breath, Joe activated the detonator. The explosion rocked the ship, sending a shock wave through the alien forces. The neural hub disintegrated in a flash of light, and with it, the connection between the aliens and their human slaves was severed. Across the country, the implanted soldiers collapsed, freed from the invaders' control. The alien drones faltered, their once coordinated attacks falling into disarray. In the skies above Washington, the massive command ship began to tremble. It was over. Back in the war room, Mitchell watched as the alien forces crumbled. The invaders had fallen, not because of superior firepower, but because they had underestimated the resilience and ingenuity of the people they sought to enslave. Joe's squad emerged from the wreckage, battered but alive. Around them, the remnants of the alien army lay in ruins, their ships abandoned, their soldiers defeated. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, a new day dawned for humanity. Joe looked at the shattered remains of the command ship, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what they had accomplished. "We did it," he whispered, almost in disbelief. Lena smiled, her eyes reflecting the first light of the morning. "Yeah, we did." In the distance, the last of the alien ships disappeared over the horizon, retreating into the void from which they came. The war was over, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. America had stood, and in doing so, had saved the world.